over to the director of the Fusion Energy Foundation for Europe, who will pick up the story of these back-channel negotiations and this important strategic discussion process that was taking place. Jonathan Tennenbaum.
There's no doubt that the process leading to and from the adoption by the United States government of Lyndon LaRouche's policy for strategic defense based on new physical principles, as announced by Reagan on March 23, 1983, marks a turning point in history. The laws of the universe, which had seemed to govern the world up to that point, suddenly changed. March 23, 1983 signaled that the entire system of ideas and institutions which have governed the world increasingly during the 20th century were being swept away. For a certain time, the policies of Lynn, our policies, had moved into the White House and were governing the United States. Yes, we suffered a serious defeat. Humanity suffered a serious defeat in the subsequent period. But no one can turn the clock back to before March 23, 1983. And I think it's not incorrect to say that the punctum saliens, the historical turning point, period, which began then, is still ongoing. We're still in the middle of it. The outcome will be determined by what we are able to accomplish over the coming weeks and months. Okay. That poses the question, how do we change history? Do we change history by being rich and famous, like David Rockefeller with his beetle collection? No. David Rockefeller hasn't changed anything. He's just a menial slave, a slave of the whore of Babylon. Do we change history by occupying positions of great nominal power, like the members of the Soviet Politburo standing like a row of vodka bottles on top of Lenin's tomb? No. History swept them away. Lynn gave them a chance to change history by accepting the offer to share the SDI, but they refused. As we would say in American jargon, they blew it. They proved themselves to be impotent. So how do you change history? The lesson of March 23, 1983, which I want to elaborate for you now, is the following. You change history by making fundamental scientific discoveries, above all, and otherwise by applying and radiating the same Socratic method which is the essence of fundamental scientific discovery. That's how Nicholas of Coos did it, that's how Leibniz did it, and that's how Lynn did it and is doing it. Through examining the true story of the SDI, we can understand and learn from Lynn's unique personal role in this ongoing period of history. That role is inseparably connected with the fact that Lynn accomplished back in 1946 to 1952 a fundamental scientific discovery. And everything he has done since then, his rise to predominance as a maker of world history, has been based on nothing but that original discovery and his own constantly improving mastery of the method by which he was able to make that original discovery. To show this, I want to single out two specific contributions by Lynn, contributions that could only have been made by him, which were absolutely essential to the U.S. government's adoption of the SDI policy. They may not, these contributions, may not have been fully expressed or adequately expressed in the U.S. government's public formulation of that policy per se, but they were implicitly the basis for everything. The first of these 2 points that I have chosen to discuss was Lynn's rigorous demonstration, which he and the organization forcefully brought to the attention of all relevant individuals, that the defense and economic policies adopted by the so-called liberal establishment, the Anglo-American establishment, for the United States and the rest of the world, were leading inexorably toward World War III. The problem was not this or that detail of policy, not some specific issue or error per se, but was located in the underlying axiomatic assumptions of Anglo-American policymaking, such that each attempt by the Anglo-American elite to react to the ongoing crisis was bound, as long as they clung to those assumptions, to merely accelerate the plunge into disaster. The second crucial point was the way Lin designed a complete set of alternatives, strategic, military, and economic policies around the crucial principle of what is called rapid technological attrition combined with new physical principles. Lin, and only Lin, was in a position to specify how to organize that process in such a way that a crash program development of defensive systems would not only not be a burden to the economy, but would be the locomotive for a broad economic recovery. Exactly this feature, the prospect of an SDI-led economic boom, which in the event of shared development could also solve the most devastating problems of the Soviet economy, was key to Lin's design of the offer he made to the Soviet leadership on behalf of the US government. Now, before I elaborate these points more, I want to briefly identify Lin's original scientific discovery, or group of discoveries, which he made over the period 1946 to 1952. As Lin reports, what provoked him to embark on the essential phase of his discovery was an encounter with the famous book by Norbert Wiener on cybernetics. One thing in Wiener's book infuriated Lin to the point of his having an angry impulse to throw the book against the wall. Norbert Wiener had attempted to characterize what we call living processes by methods borrowed from Ludwig Boltzmann's statistical thermodynamics, that which is associated with the famous first and second laws of thermodynamics. And Wiener tried to do the same thing for human intelligence, developing the now famous approach of information theory. The basic assumption of Boltzmann, which Wiener took over, was that all processes of nature could be described mathematically as systems of particle-like entities interacting according to fixed laws. And Boltzmann demonstrated what already Newton had remarked in a general way, that such mathematical systems are afflicted with the inevitable tendency to run down toward states of increasing disorder. Out of this came Boltzmann's claim proof of a purported law of universal entropy. Now, Wiener noted that living processes and the effects of human intelligence show exactly the opposite tendency. But rather than understanding this fact as a devastating refutation of Boltzmann's statistical approach, which it implicitly is, Wiener chose to define the neg-entropy of living processes in terms of a progression toward what statistics regards as more orderly arrangements of particles. So also, Wiener wanted to define human intelligence as a capability to arrange objects in an orderly way, which is probably the only definition of intelligence according to which David Rockefeller could be considered intelligent, from the evidence of his beetle collection. Lin immediately saw the folly of this whole approach, recognizing in it the same devastating flaws of assumption which Leibniz had pointed out earlier in Newton's work, in the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, which Lin had already studied as a teenager. In his autobiography, Lin notes, quote, "My understanding of this error of Wiener's is the key to my original discoveries in economic science, and is therefore the key to everything which has made me an influential international figure today. That's written 1988. Now, contrary to the absurd assumption of Wiener, Boltzmann, and Newton, we have conclusive evidence featured in the Timaeus of Plato, in the works of Leonardo da Vinci, Kepler, and others, that living processes are governed as a whole by a universal geometrical principle, a principle manifested to us by the harmonics of the visible forms of living processes, living organisms, and associated with what Leonardo da Vinci and Luca Pacioli called the divine proportion, otherwise referred to as the golden mean, as a principle of geometry. Thus, life has nothing to do with assumed pairwise interactions of particles, nothing to do with the statisticians' tabulations of arrangements of objects. Living processes are governed by a principle of development which drives them through ever more dense series of changes while remaining as a principle everywhere similar to itself. Carrying the refutation of Wiener further, how might we adequately define the nature of human intelligence, and particularly what we call creative mental activity? Well, Lin proposed, let's look at the physical effect of such activity in terms of human existence, in terms of the growth of economies. For creative mental activity of individuals is the unique cause of technological progress, and technological progress is the unique cause of what makes economies grow. If we can demonstrate that healthy economic growth is governed by the same golden mean geometrical principles as living processes generally, then the same must be true for creative mental activity, which is the cause of such growth. Though a precondition for this proof, of course, is to clear away all the mental, intellectual garbage surrounding the concept of economic growth, in particular these insanities of counting money and including in the gross national product drugs and gambling profits and so forth under the heading of economic growth. So the only sane measure of growth of economies is in terms of the ability to sustain a growing human population at increasing levels of per capita consumption and physical productivity. In other words, to provide for an increasing density of human individuals, each one of whom is able to contribute at a higher level to the further growth of the economy. Once economic growth is defined by this self-reflexive concept of increase of potential population density, as Lin did, once we've done that, then the identity of the basic law of economic growth with that of living organisms generally becomes readily apparent. But that growth depends on the creative powers of the mind to continually generate and apply scientific and technological progress. If we freeze technology at some level, then society will eventually exhaust the accessible base of resources in that mode and will collapse. And therefore, even the maintenance of a constant level of potential population density requires a certain minimum rate of technological progress. So let's turn to technological progress as a mental process, as a process of development of conceptions. Well, Lin realized that the implication that the mental process, as a mental process, technological progress is implicitly measurable. We can measure it. That is already implied by the geometrical ordering of economic growth, which is the effect of such technological progress. But we can pinpoint the internal geometry of the mental process also in the following way. Technological progress is a function of the development of science. And that development, on the other hand, involves the generation of what, from a formal standpoint, appear as unbridgeable mathematical discontinuities. So let me identify the essential point in this very briefly. If we look at continued scientific progress as a continuing process, this occurs through a succession of what we could call scientific revolutions, in which the fundamental assumptions which underlay an entire period of scientific and technological development are challenged, disproved, and superseded by the invention of a crucial experiment and an accompanying new set of experimental hypotheses. So if we call the state of knowledge before such a revolution A, and the state of knowledge after the revolution B, then we see that there's no logical way to go from A to B. These two states of knowledge are formally inconsistent. They are contradictory because we changed, we disproved the basic assumption of A in going to B. So we have a gap there which represents a singularity generated by ultimately the action of a single human mind who invented and proved a crucial experiment. So, as a mental process, the technological progress upon which healthy economic growth depends generates an unending series of such singularities, from A to B to C, C to D, and so on. It therefore becomes measurable implicitly in terms of varying densities of these and comparable species of singularities. As soon as we realize that the series of revolutions, A to B, B to C, C to D, and so forth, must be lawfully ordered in a manner consistent with the divine proportion, because that's the ordering of economic growth. So how does this express itself? Well, very simply, if we look at the internal history of science, it demonstrates that important discoveries, fundamental discoveries, are never isolated chance events or simple flashes of intuition. In crossing the apparent unbridgeable gap between two stages of formal knowledge A and B, the discoverer is always energized and guided by a certain kind of idea or thought object, to use Lin's recent term, an idea of a mode of forward motion of discovery referred to classically as a higher hypothesis, which carries society forward from A to B, B to C, and so forth. But by its very nature, the fact that it effectively bridges the gaps between mutually inconsistent, formally inconsistent sets of assumptions, a higher hypothesis could never be described or communicated formally. It belongs to a higher level of conception whose relationship to the states of formal knowledge, A, B, C, D, is that of Krus's circle to its inscribed polygons. And yet, the existence of economic growth over human history proves that adequate higher hypotheses are actually generated, have been generated, are being generated, and are effectively communicated from generation to generation. And Lin identified the crucial means how this is done. It's the method of metaphor, the metaphorical communication of concepts. So, at this point, and no later, Norbert Wiener's linear information theory bites the dust. And exactly this is what comes to the fore in any period of rapid technological progress. And Lin and his collaborators have documented later, after that fundamental work, this in the course of such periods as the Italian Renaissance, the École Polytechnique of Monge and Carnot, the Göttingen School, and such more recent crash programs as the Peenemünde rocket project, the Manhattan and Apollo programs. An effective higher hypothesis must include, at least implicitly, the question of mastering the relationship between technological progress and economic growth as a functional relationship. And to analyze that, Lin studied the way in which new technologies are injected into an economy, such as typically the case, a crucial experiment which was used to refute a fundamental set of assumptions. That crucial experiment, in the form of a laboratory apparatus invented by scientists, is transformed into a new type of machine, typically a machine tool. And that new type of machine, based on that crucial new type of phenomenon, then permits an entire new classes or species of products to be produced at a higher productivity, increasing the productivity of labor. And Lin examined the propagation into an economy of successive waves of technological progress, of waves of the form A to B, B to C, and so forth. The way that propagation occurs through successive investment cycles in relation to shifts in the composition of labor, the changes in the market baskets, land use, and particularly the function of basic infrastructure. So it was clear that the relationship involved could not be described by logical deductive forms of mathematics. Does that mean that it can't be rigorously described at all? Certainly not. In fact, Lin found the key to the solution of developing a mathematical description of the relationship between technological progress, the rate of technological progress, and the rate of economic growth. He found the key to that, as he emphasizes, by looking back on the work of Bernhard Riemann on the hypotheses of geometry from the standpoint of having grasped something essential, the kernel of the later work of Georg Cantor, particularly on the so-called Olive series. And on this basis, Lin identified the fundamental constraints, among other things, which must be satisfied for healthy economic growth. Among them, I would single out, for its importance in a moment, the energy density functions. That increase in potential population density correlates with an increase in the amount of useful energy available per capita and per square kilometer, subject to the condition that the technological quality of the organization of energy application is improving. That quality of energy use can be very roughly measured by what is called the power density or energy flux density of a machine. For example, at its cutting edge of a machine, or an equivalent area of application of power. Or in the age of directed energy technologies, which we're going into now, such a power density or technological quality is correlated with the frequency and wavelength and related characteristics of the applied radiation. Let me simply note that this early work of Lin's already points directly to a higher form of new physical principles, appropriate to processes which are undergoing a rapid series of what are called phase changes. And in fact, the typical case of such a process is a human physical economy, seen as a physical process. Imagine that we are observing the Earth from some convenient place in space, and we see this physical process which is the human economy. And this physical process is going through a series of phase changes, A to B, B to C, C to D, and so forth. We see that this physical process, which is becoming more and more powerful, is bringing ever larger parts of the universe within its range, within its domain, that this process is characterized, the law of this process, can only be defined at the level of a higher hypothesis, at the level of those processes which improve higher hypotheses, called the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. Therefore, physical processes in general can only be understood at that level of metaphorical law, not by formal mathematical deductive laws, but only metaphorically. Hence, Lin's famous, or justifiably famous, writing, "Why Poetry Must Supersede Mathematics in Physics." Now, implicitly, also the same method allows us to measure ideas in terms of their effect on the physical process of the economy. It provides us a measuring rod for judging history and so on and so forth. Well, leaving that as an identification of Lin's discoveries, at least the area in which of his discoveries, let's jump forward. I'll make a big jump given the time here. Let's jump forward to the situation that confronted the world at the end of the Carter administration. Although most people don't know it, the world was headed toward World War III on a very short fuse. The essential cause, as Lin identified with increasing clarity, was the nature of the assumptions underlying the way the so-called Anglo-American establishment thought it was running the world. The mindset, the cultural outlook of that establishment was such that, to a certain extent wittingly, but also unwittingly, they were maneuvering the world step by step into a situation in which the only choice would be between total thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union or submission to a virtual dictatorship from Moscow, with a disintegration of the world into some kind of global 30 years war further down the line. Central among those axioms was the idea put forward by Russell and Szilard at the end of World War II, that the world should be run through a balance of power between two empires, Anglo-American, with England supplying the brains, US the muscle, and an Eastern empire centered in Moscow. These two empires would be adversaries, but there would also be a common understanding between them concerning the rules of the game, about how the world would be ruled between them. A game in which any independent development of sovereign nations would be crushed between the two empires. And underlying the whole thing was Malthusianism, the goal of establishing a perpetual zero-growth, feudal-like state of mankind, in which a strictly regulated population of slaves would serve a tiny minority of oligarchical families, a worldwide confederacy. This utopian scheme was associated with a military doctrine which came to be known as MAD, MAD, mutually assured destruction, already elaborated by Leo Szilard in the 50s, perhaps earlier. The idea was that the hydrogen bomb, particularly, nuclear weapons generally, should be regarded as an ultimate weapon, in a sense the end of the line in strategic armaments, against which no effective defense is possible. And each of the two superpower empires was to build up an enormous arsenal so large that even in the event one side would launch a surprise attack, the other would still have enough missiles and warheads to survive and virtually annihilate the attacker. Under this condition of mutually assured destruction, nuclear war had become impossible. At least, so thought McNamara, Kissinger, Schlesinger, and so forth. And no technological development was to be permitted to undermine this supposedly perfect system of balance of nuclear terror. So the system was to be stabilized by a freeze on scientific and technological development. The problem was, as Lin's discoveries prove in the most rigorous way, that no such scheme could possibly be stable. On the contrary, the very Malthusian axioms virtually eliminating scientific and technological progress, which are required to merely maintain a constant level of population potential, imposed upon the world a regime of downward collapse toward extinction of the human race through the combined effects of wars, famine, and pandemic diseases as the final outcome if the policies were not stopped soon enough. Now, with the Carter administration, broadly speaking, this utopian Malthusian policy had taken virtually control over the U.S. government. But there was a very specific additional problem with this, located in the different views of the other partner of this uneasy system. The Soviet rulers saw things, they looked at the West, And they saw things like the destruction of the quality of education in the United States. They saw the epidemic of drugs, the spread of the rock, drug, sex counterculture, the cancellation of long-term NASA space programs, and so on. And the Soviet nomenclatura said, what fools they are. They are destroying themselves. Let's help them to do so. And the Soviet military leadership demonstrably never accepted the rules of the mad game. Soviets built up a war-winning capability with emphasis on massive civil defense and had developed an operational plan for winning an all-out war. And meanwhile, through the forward basing of submarines and medium-range and short-range missiles in Europe, plus the implications of the EMP pin-down effect, the effective warning time to make a decision on launching of missiles was reduced to less than a few minutes. So we had a situation where a strategic military crisis of warning time reduced down to 5 minutes or less was compounded by the destabilizing and other effects of a deepening depression, plus growing insanity among the elites who were responsible for the Malthusian policies in the first place, plus the element of miscalculation implied by the fact that the Soviets did not accept the rules of the game, of the mad game. So in that situation, there were some openings, some opportunities to change things in the U.S. The Carter administration was voted out in a landslide. People had had enough. There was a craving to get back to what America used to be, to get back to economic growth, to the atmosphere of scientific and technological progress associated with the memory of John F. Kennedy's moon landing program. And the Europeans, I can avow to you, were looking to the new administration hoping there would be a return to sanity. As for the administration itself, it was a mixed bag, to put it mildly, but there was a certain openness. The better people inside the administration were open to suggestions. There was already a perceptible leaning, certain leaning in the direction of LaRouche's policies. Through the awful years of the Carter administration, LaRouche had built up a major movement as the only coherent, visible opposition to the insanity of Carter, Schlesinger, and so forth. A significant aspect of that was the quarterly LaRouche-Riemann economic analysis, which demonstrated the unique authority of Lin's method in analyzing the decline of the U.S. industrial production in contradiction to the so-called predictions of all the other projecting agencies. So, in that situation, the challenge was how to design an improved policy which would assure war avoidance on the short and medium term, and at the same time provide the world as a whole with a long-term pathway into the future, securing the survival and progress of civilization for 50 years ahead. At the time, Lin designed his strategic defense policy. The idea of laser and particle beam weapons to defend against nuclear missiles was not at all new. Shortly after the first successful demonstration of an optical laser, Soviet Marshal V.D. Sokolovsky announced in the 1962 edition of his book on Soviet military strategy that the Soviet Union had embarked on a long-term program to develop laser and particle beam weapons. And he remarked that these technologies would overcome the inherent shortcomings of the anti-missile missiles, which were demonstrated to those of us who followed the situation quite well in the performance of the Patriots in the Gulf War. In the subsequent period, through the end of the 1970s, both superpowers had programs to develop beam weapons. There was, however, a characteristic difference. The Soviets were committed to developing an operational beam weapon defense as soon as possible. They attached the highest priority to this area. They deployed their best scientists and pushed the work forward in a hubristic manner from one breakthrough to the next. Whereas, especially under the Kissinger policies, the United States was not only not committed to developing beam weapon defenses, but officially regarded them as undesirable, as a destabilization of the MAD doctrine. As a result, the U.S. beam weapon program was kept on what you might call the back burner. It was relegated more or less to the task of making sure that the United States would not be taken off guard in the event of major Soviet progress. LaRouche was already familiar with many of the essentials of directed energy technology through the work of the Fusion Energy Foundation, which he had played the major part in launching back in 1974. The focus of the FEF's work was, of course, to promote fundamental research, development, and application of controlled nuclear fusion as the major energy source for mankind in the future. The crucial thing about fusion, clear at that time, is not that the supply of fuel for fusion reactors is virtually unlimited, which is true, but rather the fact that fusion reactors can potentially deliver power in various forms at an energy flux density many orders of magnitude higher than conventional nuclear or fossil fuel plants. This implied that fusion technology is associated with an intrinsically higher economic productivity as compared with the other forms of power production. Reference what I said about the constraints, Lin's constraints. For example, we can use energy-dense plasmas to process low-concentration ores, industrial waste, or even ordinary rocks and dirt into high-quality materials at a very tiny fraction of the present cost per unit output. Furthermore, given that 99% of the universe is plasma, it's an area of fundamental research uniting the microcosmos and the macrocosmos. Now it's clear that if we can master the means to generate and control the kinds of energy densities associated with what's called hot fusion, and if in connection with this we learn how to focus such flows of energy, propagate them through space and through various media, and tune them to various media, then it's obvious we can come up with weapons vastly more powerful than anything known up to now. In a certain sense, the internal features of the H-bomb design, hydrogen bomb design, itself announced the onset of an era of directed energy technology, which would make the bomb, in that form at least, ultimately obsolete. You have to look at the focusing of geometrical focusing of shock waves, isentropic compression, and particularly the tuning and partial lasing of radiation used in various of these H-bomb designs to generate the fusion process. This crucial fact of the implication already in the development of nuclear weapons, of a further development in direction of directed energy weapons, was, of course, ran counter to the MAD doctrine and was therefore suppressed massively with the help of classification policies, including classifying speeches given by Soviet scientists coming to the United States, a very strange policy. Hence, there was a tumultuous response when an article to that effect was published in the newspaper New Solidarity in October 1976. Hence, through this, so we could say in a certain way that if you take an H-bomb and you turn it inside out, you already have, in a certain way, a directed or a mental model of a directed energy weapon. In any case, LaRouche was not at all surprised at the revelations of U.S. Air Force's General Keegan concerning the existence of large Soviet effort for beam weapons. He was familiar with the quality of Soviet work in the relevant areas. And there were discussions with Keegan. And the FEF, as was mentioned, made an independent evaluation, published in New Solidarity, and the pamphlet referred to. And some of the authors of that pamphlet are still alive and kicking right here in this room. By the middle to the late 1970s, scientific proof of principle had been established for a wide range of beam weapons suitable to destroy missiles and nuclear weapons in flight. So that was not the invention of Lin and LaRouche. But this mere scientific feasibility by no means demonstrates the possibility of an entirely new strategic doctrine. All kinds of doubts and objections could be raised and were, even by those who did not support the MAD doctrine. Wouldn't the cost of an effective system be astronomical, exorbitant? How would we pay for it? And can't any defensive system be defeated by countermeasures? And so on and so forth, all the arguments many of us heard. Well, the most essential thing that Lynn contributed was his solution based on the economics discoveries I referred to earlier to the problem of how to organize the economy for an unprecedented rate of technological attrition in the relevant fields. And this high rate of technological attrition solves implicitly every problem posed by the design of a competent SDI. First, it was clear that the idea of an ultimate, invincible beam weapon defense system was as silly as the idea of an invincible offensive system. Every development of defense might eventually be countered by countermeasures of the offense. But, Lynn pointed out, provided that a high rate of technological development is maintained, beam weapons and related systems as a family, an open-ended family, embody an intrinsically greater firepower than the slow nuclear-carrying missiles. Lynn demonstrated the relationship between firepower in military technology and energy flux density in technology generally. So, the defense in such a force development would become increasingly dominant, asymptotically making nuclear missiles obsolete. In particular, Lynn showed that the higher firepower embodied in beam weapon technologies as a family meant that it would become far cheaper to destroy one missile with a defensive system per missile destroyed than to produce and launch that missile. And thus, the defense becomes a superior investment compared to the offense. But the most crucial point is the economic significance of technological attrition. If we think not of a single technological level of defense A, but instead of a process of driving defensive technologies through a series of evolutionary stages, A, B, C, D, embodying breakthroughs in advanced science, and if we organize the economy in such a way as to rapidly integrate the technological spillovers into the civilian economy, then the increased rate of growth of productivity of the economy pays back the investment into the SDI many times over. As Lynn put it, we can spend for such an SDI all day long and be richer the more we spend. An effect which was demonstrated to a certain extent already by the Kennedy's Apollo program, which returned an estimated $5 to $10 to the economy for every dollar spent. Well, as a last point I want to put before you here is a deeper level of this whole thing, the cultural level. A high rate of technological attrition meant that if the technology was shared, the same effect of a payoff into the civilian economy could in principle be achieved in the Soviet economy and in other economies. But there was a problem, intrinsic problem of the Soviet economy, which perhaps will be discussed a little bit later. That in offering to the Soviets to share the development of the SDI, Lynn was offering them, in fact, a transformation of their society. A very different transformation than the disastrous shock therapy of Sachs et al. But a transformation nevertheless. And to pinpoint it, perhaps the following example. If you see how the so-called Mittelstand operates in a condition of a healthy economy, the small and medium level entrepreneur or farmer in the West in the best periods, there's a phenomenon called, you might call, technological depreciation, which means, simply put, that if I have a machine operating, which I've just purchased, I can let it run, but maybe halfway through its life, there's a new technology introduced, a machine with a higher productivity. and that I can benefit more by throwing away the machine I had, even though only half of its life has been used, and introducing the new machine. Although I've lost half of the life, I've gained potentially much more by the higher productivity of that machine. And therefore, in a condition of technological attrition, you have a rapid replacement of technology much quicker than the exhaustion of their effective or nominal life. So the Western entrepreneur and worker not only does this out of a profit motive, but likes this. They swim in this kind of progress like a fish in water. That's what makes life exciting. That's what realizes the higher purpose of economic activity. But there's a cultural problem associated with what Lynn identified as the peasant problem of the Soviet economy, which predates the socialist system. Typically, machines will be run until many times after their effective life was exhausted, because the machine was regarded as a value. And therefore, you don't throw away a value you have, but you keep the value. So you find machines operating in the DDR that were already from the 19th century, and in the Soviet Union worse. So therefore, what Lynn was offering was in this offer was a transformation of Soviet society culturally through a policy of technological attrition. That's what they rejected. They rejected it, as Lynn emphasized, on cultural grounds. They refused to change that culture. Well, to end, I think what Lynn had in mind was very much underlined by the policy he announced later in 1985, with already anticipations before, of adding to the SDI the Moon Mars program. The idea of a 40-year project to establish permanent manned colonies on Mars. And that on the one side, technologically, is nearly identical in terms of technologies to the SDI, but demonstrates more clearly the economic function of the SDI, namely to increase the potential population density of the human species to the point where we can support human beings even on a planet 50 million miles away, 50 million kilometers away. So let's just think about the sad effects of the refusal by the Soviet leadership and the way in which it was permitted for Lynn to be put in jail. That instead of sitting here in this devastated world, we could already be jumping around on the moon and engaged in exciting technological progress. Thank you. To organize that process in such a way that a crash program development of defensive systems would not only not be a burden to the economy, but would be the locomotive for a broad economic recovery. Exactly this feature, the prospect of an SDI-led economic boom, which in the event of shared development could also solve the most devastating problems of the Soviet economy, was key to Lynn's design of the offer he made to the Soviet leadership on behalf of the US government. Now, before I elaborate these points more, I want to briefly identify Lynn's original scientific discovery, or group of discoveries, which he made over the period 1946 to 1952. As Lynn reports, what provoked him to embark on the essential phase of his discovery was an encounter with the famous book by Norbert Wiener on cybernetics. One thing in Wiener's book infuriated Lynn to the point of his having an angry impulse to throw the book against the wall. Norbert Wiener had attempted to characterize what we call living processes by methods borrowed from Ludwig Boltzmann's statistical thermodynamics, that which is associated with the famous first and second law. But they were implicitly the basis for everything. The first of these 2 points that I have chosen to discuss was Lin's rigorous demonstration, which he and the organization forcefully brought to the attention of all relevant individuals, that the defense and economic policies adopted by the so-called liberal establishment, the Anglo-American establishment, for the United States and the rest of the world, were leading inexorably toward World War III. The problem was not this or that detail of policy, not some specific issue or error per se, but was located in the underlying axiomatic assumptions of Anglo-American policymaking, such that each attempt by the Anglo-American elite to react to the ongoing crisis was bound, as long as they clung to those assumptions, to merely accelerate the plunge into disaster. The second crucial point was the way Lin designed a complete set of alternatives, strategic, military, and economic policies around the crucial principle of what is called rapid technological attrition combined with new physical principles. Lin, and only Lin, was in a position to specify how
Over to the director of the Fusion Energy Foundation for Europe, who will pick up the story of these back-channel negotiations and this important strategic discussion process that was taking place. Jonathan Tennenbaum.
There's no doubt that the process leading to and from the adoption by the United States government of Lyndon LaRouche's policy for strategic defense based on new physical principles, as announced by Reagan on March 23, 1983, marks a turning point in history. The laws of the universe, which had seemed to govern the world up to that point, suddenly changed. March 23, 1983 signaled that the entire system of ideas and institutions which have governed the world increasingly during the 20th century were being swept away. For a certain time, the policies of Lin, our policies, had moved into the White House and were governing the United States. Yes, we suffered a serious defeat. Humanity suffered a serious defeat in the subsequent period. But no one can turn the clock back to before March 23, 1983. And I think it's not incorrect to say, by making fundamental scientific discoveries, above all, and otherwise by applying and radiating the same Socratic method which is the essence of fundamental scientific discovery. That's how Nicholas of Coos did it, that's how Leibniz did it, and that's how Lin did it and is doing it. Through examining the true story of the SDI, we can understand and learn from Lin's unique personal role in this ongoing period of history. That role is inseparably connected with the fact that Lin accomplished back in 1946 to 1952 a fundamental scientific discovery. And everything he has done since then, his rise to predominance as a maker of world history, has been based on nothing but that original discovery and his own constantly improving mastery of the method by which he was able to make that original discovery. To show this, I want to single out two specific contributions by Lin, contributions that could only have been made by him, which were absolutely essential to the U.S. government's adoption of the SDI policy. They may not, these contributions, may not have been fully expressed or adequately expressed in the U.S. government's public formulation of that policy per se. Say that the punctum saliens, the historical turning point, period, which began then, is still ongoing. We're still in the middle of it. The outcome will be determined by what we are able to accomplish over the coming weeks and months. Okay. That poses the question, how do we change history? Do we change history by being rich and famous like David Rockefeller with his beetle collection? No. David Rockefeller hasn't changed anything. He's just a menial slave, a slave of the whore of Babylon. Do we change history by occupying positions of great nominal power, like the members of the Soviet Politburo standing like a row of vodka bottles on top of Lenin's tomb? No. History swept them away. Lin gave them a chance to change history by accepting the offer to share the SDI, but they refused. As we would say in American jargon, they blew it. They proved themselves to be impotent. So how do you change history? The lesson of March 23rd, 1983, which I want to elaborate for you now, is the following. You change history